Carlton King is a former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in a jihadi organisation.
My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy Podcast, the show that shines a light on the world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations. But really what we do, as regular listeners will know, and if you're not a regular listener or you are a regular listener and you haven't subscribed, please subscribe because that aids and assists us and we can get our message to more people. What we actually do is we look at geopolitics in the round. So that's from the macro to the micro. And we try and talk about the things that will be of interest to very many people over very many areas. But we often concentrate on the world of political intrigue, intelligence, national security, etc., as well as other issues which touch into those areas. So yes, last week we spoke about the press, and of course that angle was encompassed within that as well. So that's the way we work, or as one might say in the modern days, that's how we roll. So here we go. Today what I want to do actually is I want to look at a fundamental question for the West. And that fundamental question really is it's about President Donald J. Trump's mental capacity, let's put it that way, about his ability to perform the role in a statesman-like, centralist, let's say, potentially prominent. And by what I mean by that is that the United States for many a year has claimed to be the world's policeman. It's claimed to be the world's sort of central thinker in terms of liberal policy, etc. Although I question that. I question both aspects really. But it on the surface, one could be fooled into believing that in both areas. And not to be hegemonistic in any way, shape or means. Now, we can obviously see that it is and has been throughout its history, particularly since the Second World War, its history whereby it became one of the superpowers and then thereafter the fall of the Soviet Union, the only superpower. We can actually see that the United States hasn't worked simply to aid and assist the rest of the world. It's worked to aid and assist the United States primarily, and then maybe secondary, it has had this position, albeit again, I would doubt that, very questionably. And I'm not going to go into those areas because we've already spoke about them so much. But I just want to look at how the openness of President Trump in this second term has changed all that. Because what he's done is he's brought into the light the activities of the United States that were generally before in the dark corners, in the recesses of political power, particularly geopolitical power, where might is right, which it has generally always been, to be fair, to the US, but now it's articulated very, very openly, first in MAGA, and then, which again would be questionable, is what he's doing of advantage to the average American, questionable. And then in terms of raw US power, the wanton utility of the military without hiding behind some particular political process, like this person is whatever, this country is whatever, and we are assisting in order to prevent this country from being negative towards the world, whatever the country might be. So again, a hidden, if you will, objective, but poised oftentimes well in an objective that one could sell to the rest of the world as being something that was not only in the US's interest, but in the interest of most of the sensible parts of the world. And you can read for that European and US, with a few sort of flutterings of places like Japan, South Korea, maybe even you can go as far as the Philippines to some extent. You know, countries which might have seen themselves as within the US orbit, within the West's orbit. The problem is that behind the scenes, and I know this is why we do secret intelligence and national security, behind the scenes we know that that's not always the reality of the circumstance. We know that that's something that's been played upon in order to advance the goals of the United States. And, you know, to some extent, those that followed it. So like us, example, the United Kingdom, we often began to believe that following them, the United States, was advantageous to us on the world stage, and hence we followed the United States. And the only real person that I can see that sat back off any of that, frankly, was Harold Wilson, who had the balls, and I'm going to use that word, cojones, to basically say, no, United States, I'm not following you into Vietnam. Now, in doing that, the presidents of the day, obviously, I'm guessing, so I'm guessing here, I'm not guessing about the outcome, but I'm guessing about the authority, obviously must have authorised, not must have, could have authorised the dogs of war, the CIA, to then have a very strong look at Wilson and, of course, start pernicious rumours about Wilson being a Soviet agent. And those who listen regularly to the show understand the difference between an agent as an FBI agent, so an agent of the government, and what we say in the secret intelligence world, what we call people whom we have turned, be they civilian people, people in governments, people in terrorist organisations, whatever, whom we have turned to become our agents. That's to work for us as people whom we control in some way, we have access to in some way. Particularly in, we use this terminology within the British system, and that therefore orientated the ex-colonials to utilise this language as well. But of course, you've got American systems whereby an agent is a clear agent of the federal government, and they would call such a person a confidential informant. And of course, in general police terms in the United Kingdom, you can call such a person whom you've turned and you are using as a CHIS, a covert a human intelligence source. So you're using that source of covert human intelligence. Now, generally, in the secret intelligence world, within the United Kingdom, within the agencies and the old special branch, which was basically a part of the agencies, we would call such individuals agents. So, yeah, so what they were articulating is that Harold Wilson was an agent of the Soviet Union, and therefore he needed to be removed. Now, the chief of CIA counterintelligence, Angle Islington, he was the one who basically drove this policy to try and do that. And now we go into a little bit of a darker area that is not fully shed light upon, but we know, and I'm cautious as I'm saying it, that there was some contention by various bodies in the United Kingdom, particularly within the military, and particularly from organisations like the Guards, following the lead of the previous Viceroy of India, and there's a very good book about him and his wife, the Mountbattens it's called, for one of the guests I've had on the show, actually, Andrew Lowney, and I think Andrew covers this angle, that there were moves potentially by Mountbatten to lead a coup against, I don't know how far it got, I've got to say that, I wasn't in the game then, I don't know how far it's got, but to lead a coup against Harold Wilson. I think actually what really happened was that it was sufficient within the party, the Labour Party that is, of whom Harold was the leader and hence Prime Minister when Labour were in power, to basically stir up enough trouble on the Labour right and even to some extent on the Labour centre, although I wouldn't turn around and say that Harold was a left-wing Labour individual. But I'd say he was centre-left, maybe left to centre-left. But stirred up enough, and it was made known enough that the dark forces that be, and in this case the primary angle within the United Kingdom obviously would be the security service, were MI5, that's the real name of the security service, were maybe or maybe not, that bit we don't know. We know that the CIA counterintelligence body was, but was the security service also involved? We know an investigation went on. I mean, that's as much as we do know. An investigation took place. We don't know what efforts were done to try and remove Harold from power. So, the only reason why I'm saying that is because anybody who followed Harold Wilson to become Prime Minister then understood, maybe with the exception of Jeremy Corbyn, who ploughed a similar field, I would say, in terms of trying to be independent from the United States and definitely independent from the State of Israel. You would see that Jeremy was banished before he even got to power. So I think that what I'm saying is most people have learnt, don't go down that route because you will lose power quickly or you won't even get to power. So that's why I bring that up. Now, why is that relevant? Because in the past, when these sort of activities were taking place, the President of the United States, even if his hand was in the game, if he was sitting at the poker table, right, one didn't know he was at the poker table, if you will. He was kind of hidden from view, and the hand was being played by one of the 17 agencies, oftentimes the Central Intelligence Agency, that represents the US's secret intelligence operations. And I say one of them or more because, of course, a very useful agency is also the National Security Agency, because they're listening to everything, so therefore they've got great access to what people are saying. And of course that utility of that information can be passed through various other bodies. So that's why I say one of the 17 intelligence agencies, because any of them can get the information. Obviously the FBI can, and maybe even any of the military intelligence agencies of the United States can pick up info and utilize it to the advantage of the United States, if the presidency believes that is the case, or even bodies within the United States, not necessarily coming from the president, believe that is the case. But it's all done hush-hush behind closed doors, in the way that they learnt, frankly, particularly the Central Intelligence Agency, in the way they learnt from us, the British, during the Second World War and to some extent after it. They learnt how to play the game from the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, you'll know it as, but real name, the Secret Intelligence Service. That's how the CIA learnt to play the game. However, now we have in stock, sitting there at the table, not hiding the fact that he's sitting at the table, bringing all the monies together and all the cards out, even having people deal the cards, is President Trump. So this guy is not hiding anything. It may well have been the case that for years the United States coveted Greenland. And so what it did is it put bases on Greenland, still has bases there today, and really with that, especially in such a small land that, yes, is supposedly protected by Denmark, but come on. So in such a small land, it can make people function to its needs. However, Trump throws that away and says, I'll just take it. Bigger still, he says the same thing about an even stronger partner to the north of the United States in Canada. And yes, they've been robustly utilising Canada forever and a day and playing within Canada's internal affairs forever and a day. But of course, again, not articulated. This gentleman, Trump, articulates it openly and says, this is what's going to happen. You're going to be State 51 of us. So what you find is a man who, as I said before, is, with gran cojones, he's out there saying what he's thinking. The question is, though, is he totally in control of his own ideals, or are others pulling the strings behind him? Now, in some ways, I can think about the bigger picture. There may well be bodies pulling the bigger strings. It's clear to me that, and anybody else who really wants to know anything about it, that when you look at Jeffrey Epstein, it's clear to me that he was most probably an Israeli agent. And again, by that I mean utilised by the State of Israel. I don't mean a Mossad officer, I mean an agent. It's clear to me. But he may also be a joint agent. And that's, agencies do that, run agents jointly. It might have done many. So they may be joint with the Central Intelligence Agency, because there is a feel that agency in particular is not necessarily fully in control or being fully controlled, let's put it better that way, by the White House. So it may well be that agency can utilise others to put its messages through, or work with its messages, or work in tandem with its messages with other agencies, if those other agencies are thinking in the same way as the agency, or even be strange bedfellows and have at this particular time the same reasons for outcomes. So what I'm saying is, they don't need to be believing in exactly the same thing or want exactly the same thing, but put together, they may be close enough that they can work in tandem on a particular issue. So, that's how that could come about. That, yes, this guy's coming. Because one of the bad things I think that Trump did for himself, was in his first term, he basically gave the CIA scant regard. I heard that instead of the daily briefings that every president has been eager to listen to daily and been eager to find out what's going on in the world, been eager to be informed of the latest intel and intrigue. Every president's wanted that. Trump apparently said to briefers, come back when you got something new. Otherwise, don't bother me. You told me the same thing yesterday. And so the daily brief, which gives you a lot of power, in fact, to the agency, because each day the briefer was going in and saying to the president, this is what it is, and this is the evaluation of the agency, blah, 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 blah. He was saying to it, don't bother, mate. Come back later on when you've got something that I want, right? And that limits the power of the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, I know the Central Intelligence Agency power was limited by to their way of thinking. Let's put it that way. Make it clear. To their way of thinking. The agency's way of thinking were limited by Clinton, because a relatively senior officer said it to me. A Central Intelligence Agency officer said it to me. He said Clinton has clipped our wings, right? So, and when I think of that, I've got to kind of laugh, because they were actually quite, let's say, unfettered in their activities. So I can't really see how clipped the wings were in terms of that. Obviously, under Bush, they became even more unfettered in the war on terror, etc., etc. But this is the problem. So it's what agencies think and how senior individuals in those agencies think that often matters as well. So we've got this position whereby Trump may or may not be working to the position of one of its agencies and one of another country's agencies in the way that he himself wants to, but he's working, if you will, to their ideals because there's a puppet master somewhere behind them. And, there's a whole host of speculation about that, and I won't need to go. People who listen to this program understand who the puppet master might be or might not be. So that's something I don't need to really go into. If you're a geopolitical listener, a geopolitical reader, you'll understand that all day long. And you'll understand that some people said, yeah, that is the way it is, and some other people say, no, it isn't, and etc., etc. All we do know is that right now, the United States is in a war against Iran with one of the potential puppet masters of the President of the United States. So you've got that position. Right, so now let's look at another dynamic position of the president. And I think probably the most powerful position of the president. I'm wondering how much of what actually happens is a reflection or a reaction to what the president says in his Truth Socials. I noticed it the other day. He brought out a Truth Social saying, we're going to blockade the Strait of Hormuz. Now, it was clear to me, absolutely clear to me, that no thinking president of the United States, or indeed of any other country, would turn around and say, we are going to blockade the Straits of Hormuz, and this is the big point, and any vessel coming out of there that has paid the toll which the Iranians are asking for in order for that country's ships to be filled with oil, any country that's paid that toll, or indeed, he went a step further, didn't he? Or indeed, any country that is going to try and pay that toll by getting filled up by the Iranians will be blockaded and stopped and boarded by the United States if necessary. Right? Now, those of you in the know, those of you who understand the program, those of you who listen to my program all the time, you will understand that one of the major bodies that is part of this process and is willing to pay the toll, because actually the toll is paid in UN, is China. Right? So China needs its oil from Iran. China is a friend of Iran within BRICS. Okay? So within BRICS, Iran is now a leading Yeah, I'm going to say a leading partner. It's not one of the original partners, but it is now one of the leading partners in BRICS. Obviously, the two most powerful elements within BRICS are Russia and China. Now, people will turn around and say, India's powerful. Yes, it is. But India kind of plays a halfway route in BRICS. It's one of those things that you question whether you can actually trust India within BRICS, or whether it's just keeping all options open, or indeed even acting as some sort of fifth column within BRICS. So, it's questionable how tied to BRICS India is, even though it's one of the founder members. Brazil, Russia, China, India, and South Africa being the founder members, of BRICS. So the question is, with this, a body which presently, it is being seen as a counterweight to the G7. It's not necessarily a counterweight to the G7 or the G20. It's just that it's a body that is conscious of the US's position of omnipotence, and therefore is conscious that if you make an enemy of the United States, you can be destroyed. It's even more conscious now that, all parts of President Trump's, if you will, administration are articulating this a lot louder than what they used to. So if you remember a few weeks back, I played you what Scott Bessent was saying. The Treasury Secretary, where these things in the past used to be relatively hidden, and there's always a reason that you can get around it and say, we are putting sanctions on an individual because they're doing this, this and this. We don't want to cause problems for the citizenry of Iran. We're just trying to control its leaders, blah, 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 blah. Now they make no bones about it. Bessent turns around and says, we destroyed the economy of Iran in order to get people out on the streets. And then you get ex-leader of the Central Intelligence Agency coming on saying, we and Mossad are walking hand in hand with the Iranians on the streets who are demonstrating against the Iranian government. Then Trump turns around and says, we provided a whole load of weapons to these demonstrators, right? Demonstrators that I know and that I was looking into when I was running the National Public Order Intelligence Unit, Strategic Analysis Unit, when we were assessing demonstrations throughout the United Kingdom. We weren't saying these demonstrators were carrying arms and shooting police, etc., and burning people. But, Trump's saying, we provided a whole host of arms so these people can carry out actions. I think, was it actions or activities? Or he might have even turned around and said revolution. I can't remember the exact quote, but he did say that. And this is what I mean. Is he just open, or is he making mistakes? Or is he just arrogant to the position whereby saying, I'll say what I want, do what I want, because there's nothing you can do about it. And I'm showing you my power. Is that what it is? I can't fathom it. Or is it, and myself and Dr. Rachel is a regular on here and is a scientist who deals with the brain and the understanding of the brain. We wrote a book quite recently, which you can get on Amazon, right, in which we talk about the male menopause. Okay? And in that book, what we looked at is the kind of causal link between the male menopause and falling libido, and what that actually meant for many an older man in terms of the hidden crises that it created. Of men trying to hold on to that powerful position of the bodily libido and not then wishing to if you will, be seen to step or climb down in any way, shape, just to show that they're virile and still strong. And, Dr. Rachel articulated that within the book, how this can be something that happens and indeed does happen. And I showed you how this has potentially happened with previous leaders who could have driven a path that was actually much more conciliatory, but chose to be much more macho because of their feelings of lack of libido, etc. And trying to compensate for that became more aggressive than they were when they were younger. So, by the way, as I said, the book is available at Amazon, and it's called Male Menopause, The Hidden Crisis, by myself and Dr. Rachel. And if you're at all interested in that, if indeed you are suffering from that, or if indeed you think that the man in your life is suffering from that. And the one thing that I found out from Dr. Rachel when we were putting the book together was that this actually can start very early. People as young as 35 can also already start suffering from this. I guess like a female in perimenopause. The same type of thing, because you get the same type of brain fog, etc., but you get the masculinity element of men jumping in there that you potentially don't get with women, because the man has had this Overfluss, as the Germans would say, this over abundance of testosterone that then is starting to seep away, and then you feel this lack of power in going forward. And if that is of great importance to you, you don't want to lose that power, so you show it in different ways. So potentially that's one of the reasons why President Trump acts the way he does. Now, there are others who stipulate it in a different way. He may or may not have menopausal problems, but also his problem is that maybe he has problems with some type of senility. Now, I don't know. I'm not a doctor. I don't know at all. But what I do know is, having been in the game, that you will find that basically every intelligence agent, foreign intelligence agencies, individuals, and I would even imagine the security agency of the United States, so in that terms the FBI, would be considering trying to assess the capacity of the president without him actually knowing. They'll be trying to see, is this man all there? Now, don't get me wrong, we had a guy who who was in the White House for 4 years, who by the end of it didn't know whether to turn left or right, couldn't string two sentences together, and people were still saying to him, go on for another 4 years. So it isn't just because your faculties have lessened, doesn't mean to say in the United States system that all of a sudden you will be removed on the 25th Amendment and somebody else will take your place. That somebody else being, of course, in the first instance, the the Vice President. Because that's the role of the Vice President, obviously, to take over in dire circumstance, or whatever the reason might be, why the President has gone. We've seen it twice in our lifetime, haven't we? We saw it with JFK and his assassination, and we also saw it with Tricky Dick, as the Americans used to call him, Nixon, and his resignation. So we saw it twice. So we know the process. The Vice President jumps in, which may well be the case why the present Vice President Vance doesn't do anything to try and undermine his position. And also why, on the other hand, the President tries to get him to perform acts which the public will look at him and say, oh, he's no good. So you get both sides, because politics is a dirty game, isn't it? You get both sides. It's basically like what Theresa May did to Johnson. Boris, as he loved to be called, had the ear of the people, incorrectly, a charlatan in my eyes, incorrectly, but he had the thing of the people, right? So you had a problem then for any Prime Minister, because they had to deal with Boris. How do we deal with Boris? Well, Theresa May, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom's position was, let's make him Foreign Secretary. Now, you turn around and say to yourself, Foreign Secretary, for American listeners, that's Secretary of State, what a powerful position you put this guy in. Yes, but think about what the Foreign Secretary does. He goes and visits foreign countries. So internally, where most of the decisions are made as to how rulers function and what the public think of rulers, they don't think about what the rules are based on foreign events. They think of what's happening, as Clinton put it, the economy, stupid, what's happening within the state itself that's being run by those particular individuals. So any Prime Minister wants to make sure they have a Chancellor who sings to their hymn sheet, and, of course, that any potential rivals are in roles which keeps them, frankly, away from internal power. And so that's what they did with Boris. Frankly, it was the worst thing that happened for the United Kingdom. He changed how the Foreign and Commonwealth Office worked, and I had never before seen a position whereby ambassadors, who generally say very little negative to the United Kingdom, actually came out en masse at one stage suggesting that what Boris was doing was incorrect and suggesting that he was a liability. In diplomatic language, of course, because this is Great Britain, it's not the United States. So, but that's basically what was happening. So even making moves like that can be problematic. But of course, how do you deal with such a person? I'm going to be relatively crude because it's not my language. It's the language of one of those individuals who obtained the position of President of the United States due to an assassination. So you now know who that is. Everybody knows that Lyndon Johnson became president because JFK was assassinated. And Lyndon Johnson's version of that, what do we do with a tempestuous individual who's looking for my job? He said, it's better having somebody in the tent pissing out than pissing in. So in other words, he kept them close. He kept them close. He didn't send them away. He kept those rivals particularly close to him so he could monitor them and monitor what they were doing. You know, Nixon obviously was even definitely people who were on the other side, on the Democratic side. He was looking at them in terms of Watergate and carrying out burglaries to see what they're doing. This is the filth of what we call democracy. So, and anyway, coming back to President Trump. And the reason why I've mentioned those others is it's not just Trump doing this stuff. What I'm trying to say to you is Trump is open. That's the problem. And I think his problem is he wakes up or indeed doesn't go to sleep. That, you know, it may be something as simple as the guy doesn't sleep. Because if you look at some of these truth socials he's doing them at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. You know, and he's knocking out several a day sometimes. Or should I say a night. So when is he sleeping? You know, so something comes to his mind. Blockade, bang. Oh yeah, blockade, we'll have that. That's a good idea. Nobody's there at all to kind of temper him in this moment. So he just knocks it out on a true social. Now, I don't know if they've got people vetting that true social or rewriting those true socials to some extent, but clearly if he has his own ideas and wants them out, he's pushing them out because that's the way he is. So, you know, this last one, you could imagine them saying, all right, so, oh, bloody hell, Trump's gone and said we're going to board every bloody ship. What are we going to do? So then the problem is the intelligence agencies and the military have got to figure out how they can bring into being his actions that he's putting through social without it causing riotous problems. And don't get me wrong, this works internally as well. You know, you can see, let ICE do what they want to do. Oh, right. And I'm going to put this woman in charge of ICE so she'll do exactly what I'm telling her to do because I know she's a MAGA and believes in me. Bosh, in. Right? Now, every person you see, ship them back. But, well, hold on. What? How does that work? Right? So now you're going to have people who do things, thinking, yeah, that's what I've been told, I'll carry it out. People who try to do things, get fired. So the next guy who comes in, or gal, comes in and then thinks to themselves, I'm going to do exactly what he said, even though it's negative. Or maybe they even feel that way. Maybe they think, well, he's got the balls to do it, so I'm going to carry it out. But he leaves them, if you will, dangling when it goes wrong. So clearly they must be understanding that aspect. You know, and people will listen to this and think, I'm talking a lot of rubbish. No president is like that. No president just makes stuff up and people go with it. Right, I'm going to tell you something that you can actually listen to. All of you will know one of the things that are interested in geopolitics, that is, one of the things that caught President Nixon, Tricky Dick as he used to call him because he was so tricky, was that he had put into the Oval Office a recording system, as he used to call it in those days, years ago, right? A recording system. So they recorded everything. And it seems, potentially, that he forgot that it was there. So he just spoke kind of openly. You know, just spoke as it was. You know, and just one thing came out quite recently when he was talking about African nations supporting the reallocation of what they then called Red China, the People's Republic of China rather than Taiwan, into the United Nations as the Chinese body. So they came onto the permanent members position, the Chinese. Okay. And when the vote went through, a lot of African nations, because China had aided them as had the Soviet Union, voted for the Chinese. Well, within that, you get Nixon talking to future President Reagan saying that these apes have voted this way. Half of them weren't even used to wearing shoes. Why have they got votes, etc., etc., etc.? Saying the N-word, these apes, these N's have got this. Right, so he's forgotten this is just being recorded. Or he don't care. Which is the other side you can look at it at. He doesn't care. But anyway, and did Reagan know he was being recorded when he was talking in this manner? Right. So why do I mention these recordings? Because during one of these recordings, he says to his chief of staff, he says, listen, I'm going to give you orders. And some of those orders are going to be outrageous because that's just the way I am. I know my character. Sometimes I get overblown with anger or whatever it might be. And I may turn around and say, and I'm paraphrasing here because I'm not saying it exactly, do this, like blow up the world or something. So that was part one of this week's Black Spy podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll have part two next week.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.